Hey docs, and happy Friday. Dr. Jeff Langmaid, part of the Smart Chiropractor team here, and welcome to a new featured series that we are kicking off in 2021 called Clinical Conversations by the Smart Chiropractor. As you can see, today I'm going to talk a little bit about Modic Endplate changes, but we're also going to be featuring you, that is right, a bunch of members from this group that have awesome clinical skills, have already stepped up to the plate. We're going to be trying to be hosting these every other week throughout 2021 so we can all grow together, showcasing clinical pearls, points of interest, just items that happen in practice that matter. So don't worry, we're still going to be talking a lot about marketing in this group, but we want to bring in some of the clinical pearls and expertise. And I'm the one that's going to get things kickstarted in 2021 by talking a little bit about Modic Endplate changes. This is a presentation that a few years ago I gave to all of the neurosurgeons and physiatrists that I work with. So I hope that you get something out of it. It seemed as though they thought it was a good presentation, and it is. I think there's a lot of clinical nuggets and pearls within this presentation that you might not think of, or that might just not come to the surface in day-to-day practice, that are super, super important to keep in mind. So without further ado, let's talk a little bit about Modic Endplate changes. I'm going to review anatomy first. I'm going to show the model. You also have everything on the screen there. This model is by Jerome with Dynamic Disc Designs. Can't recommend his stuff enough. But basically, we have our vertebral bodies. We have the intervertebral disc that sits in between. And of course, the end plates are where the disc meets the vertebral body. Where the intervertebral disc meets the body is the end plate. That's where we're going to be focusing on today. And let's dive right in. So what are Modic changes? As you can see here, they're pathological changes. So they're not normal changes. Pathological changes to the body and end plate of the vertebra. I think we've all seen this on X-ray, certainly, where we've just seen that super white area, right? Or on an MRI where the bone just looks messy when it's meeting the disc. And sometimes I've even looked at this Modic changes before on MRI and thought there was a serious pathology going on because it just looked sloppy and messy. Everything didn't look clean and nice like you'd expect it to on the margins. Those were Modic changes ultimately for that individual. So they're pathological changes to the body and end plate of the vertebra. There's a strong correlation between Modic I changes and pain. Now we're going to talk, there's different types of Modic changes. There's Modic I, there's Modic II, etc. And not all of them correlate heavily with pain. Important clinical nugget there. Just because you see Modic changes in a report doesn't necessarily mean that the patient's going to have pain there. But if it's Modic I changes, it is highly likely that they will. We'll break that down more in a few moments. We can see here, 75% of people report constant pain. So that's an interesting thing to keep in mind. An overwhelming majority, constant pain, unrelenting pain. It's very important to keep in mind. Again, I think a lot of times with compressive pathology, we see temporary pain. You can have an antalgic lean and get away from things. With Modic changes, typically that's not the case. It's a constant source of pain. Additionally, you can see here, 75% of people will suffer pain at night. Well, pain at night typically we think of as a big red flag, and it is for cancer ultimately. However, there is overlap as you go through your history, as you're evaluating the patients in your practice, understanding that, man, Modic changes, Modic I changes specifically can cause constant pain and pain at night. It's important to keep that in mind as you go through your diagnostics in your practice. So some clinical pearls there. So the intervertebral disc, obviously the disc sits in between it. It's what we work with each and every day as chiropractors, or at least the effects of it. Now, here is the big takeaway here. The disc, we say a lot of times, and a lot of people simplify things down and say, well, the disc, it's like a shock absorber that sits between the bones. What the literature shows is that's actually not the case. The disc is not going through shock absorption. What we've seen in the research and the literature is that with axial load, with direct axial compression, the vertebra will blow out before the disc. And what we see, and what you'll see here, is that the vertebral body actually pushes and pulls, compresses, acts as more of a shock absorber, if you will, than the discs. Now, why is that? It's because, as you can see on these following items here, the disc displaces hydrostatic forces. in theory, if there's not an annular tear and it's not bulged or herniated, it's a closed unit, right? The disc is supposed to be self-encapsulated. So it really doesn't shock absorb to any degree. It's a closed unit. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means that, as you can read here, axial compression deforms the nucleus, which stresses and stiffens the annular fibers that evenly distribute the load. So as there's axial load going down upon the disc, what we see is that the annular fibers, they stiffen, and then that is what displaces the load circumferentially. Wow, a good word there. Circumferentially around the disc, which is totally different than how I normally think of it in a very simple way. You push down, it's a jelly donut. There's a lot more to it than that. There's iotas of truth with that explanation. But what we can see here is it certainly is much more complex than that once we start diving one level deeper. Also, end plates adhere to the disc and protect them from the destructive vascular tissues of the vertebral body. This is an interesting point. We know that the discs, by and large, are avascular. They have a very poor blood supply. But what we also know is that a lot of times the vascularity that happens throughout injury and aging is actually what causes the sensitization and pain that can take place in the disc over time, which is why we normally don't see discogenic pain in young people. We see discogenic pain as people get into their 40s, 50s, and 60s. It's because the disc is typically avascular. Now, that means it doesn't heal very well, but it also typically means that with that vascularity, there's not those small nerve fibers going that can produce the sensation of pain. So all of this is a balancing act. I think there's a lot of nuance here. And if you're getting any clinical pearls, be sure to leave them below. I'd love to know what's new to you. So let's talk about the end plate a little bit. The end plate, they have vascular loops that extend from the vertebral body into the end plate. So there is vascularity that goes from the vertebral body. As we know, it's bone, right? Cut into it. There is a certain amount of blood that'll happen. But there's these little loops that go down right to the edge of that, into that end plate, right to the edge of the disc. Now, over time, that's what sort of invaginates or becomes the vascular nature of what goes into the disc. But by design, they sort of loop around right at the end. These things are semipermeable. They're allowing nutrient transfer into the disc. And that's ultimately how you want a disc to heal, is through motion, compression, action, with the semi-permeability of the vascular structures that enables transfer to go through. That's the ideal state. Now, what we see again with injury and age is that vascularity continues to go in, nerve fibers go with it, discogenic pain can result. But in an ideal world, those little loops extend right to the edge of the disc, right through the end plate, semi-permeable. That's when compression, motion enables nutrient transfer. It's slow, relatively inefficient, but with that comes the benefit of not having all those nerve endings directly into the disc. So when this process is altered by age and or injury, the disc will begin to degenerate. This is the secondary portion of this that's really important to keep in mind, is that when we see that those loops extend, when we see the vascularity go into the disc, that's typically when we also start to see an acceleration of the degenerative process. So all of this is a balancing act, and I think there's a lot of interesting points here that probably we don't think of each and every day as we're taking care of patients in our practice, but are really, really important to understand over the course and duration of a patient's life. So let's talk a little bit about those vertebral bodies as well. Extremely porous, and we see this, I think, in the picture we saw at the top of this presentation as well. It's really porous, like a honeycomb style is the vertebral body. It's filled with vascular network or vessels and marrow. So what fills up that honeycomb structure? Right there. Vessels, marrow. That's what happens when we cut apart or look into a vertebral body. They are plastic. They are malleable. And we don't think of it that way. We think of bone as being one of the hardest structures, and that, oh man, the disc is really what acts as that shock absorber. And what we've seen in the literature is that's not the case. The bone actually has more malleable capacity. It's more plastic in many ways than the disc, which is not the way we think of things. But in the case of axial compression, it absolutely is the truth. It acts as the shock absorber in the system, which again is contrary to a lot of the simplistic versions that are said that the disc is that case. It's actually the bone. And compression creates retroflow of venous blood, which dampens the compressive load. So how this occurs is probably a little bit beyond what we're going to get into in today's presentation, but when there's compression, as you can see here, retroflow, so it backfills the venous blood, and that is what dampens the compressive load. So you might say, well, if you're saying that the bone is actually the bone is actually the shock absorber, how come it doesn't crumble? It doesn't crumble because there's a honeycomb pattern. It's filled, very, very much filled with not only the marrow, but the network of vessels. And that network of vessels is what, as there's compression, backfills up, creates a stiffening, and that is what dampens the compressive load, which is a wildly different way to think about how things actually happen in our body. So what are some of these types of modic changes? There's type 0, which are no modic changes, type 1, type 2, and type 3. Type 0 is there are no changes, right? Normal bones, a healthy end plate, and there's no visible marrow changes. So that's normal. Type 1 is inflammatory and there is bony edema. Now, if you remember when we started this conversation, type 1 highly correlated with pain. Why? Because it's inflammatory. So type 1 modic changes, inflammatory by nature. Type 2, things are starting to stabilize. There is less pain associated with type 2 modic changes. This is where we see that yellow fat infiltration into the end plate. This is also what you'll notice specifically on an MRI. And as we get towards type 3, these are super, super obvious, especially on an X-ray with type 3, where you have the sclerosis around the end plate, you have the degradation of bone, and you have the permanent non-reversible changes. So here's the good news about type 3 changes. You're at the end of the bell-shaped curve. You're probably not in pain, even though the picture looks terrible. If you look at type 3 modic endplate changes on a film, you're gonna be like, I can't believe this person's walking around. But by that point, you've gone through a stabilization phase, and it's quite often asymptomatic, whereas type 1 inflammatory, that's what gets people. That's what causes, in 75% of cases, the constant pain, the pain at night, all of those things that can be super confusing when you're evaluating a patient, unless you're really in tune with what's going on with modic changes. So important to keep in mind there. Pain level, we discussed this a couple times already. Modic 1, high correlation. Over 75% of people with Modic 1 changes are going to have constant pain and or pain at night. Why? Because it's inflammatory, the process is getting started, the body is aggravated, and those end plates at type 1, they are screaming at you. They are letting you know. And that is when we're seeing all of that vascularity start to go from the bone and end plate into the disc. That's what's causing the inflammatory component. That's what's creating a lot of pain. However, by the time you get to Modic 2 changes, and definitely by the time you get to Modic 3 changes, the good news is a lot of that pain has rescinded and gone away at that point. So let's take a look at our next slide here. End plate changes, microfractures in the end plate allow, so again, how does this happen? Oh, gosh, the end plate's so strong. Here we go. Microfractures in the end plate allow the passage of material from the body marrow to the subchondral end plate. This results in inflammatory response and reactionary changes. So it's microfractures throughout these end plates that allow increased permeability. This is what allows the vascular aspects of what's going on in the vertebral body to invaginate into the disc. This is what causes inflammatory response. This is what causes reactionary changes. This is what causes what we start to see on images early with Modic 1 that become clear as day as we get into Modic 2 and Modic 3. Modic classifications, let's take a look here. We have type 1, bone marrow edema and swelling. It's all going on in type 1. Hypo-intense. If you're looking at MRI images, T1 images are going to be hypo-intense. On T2, it's going to be hyper-intense. You see that bright white. If you're looking at a T2 image, it's not going to look that way on the T1 images. I know for myself, I look at T2s a lot more often, typically from a musculoskeletal standpoint. Modic 2 changes associated with that conversion of normal marrow to yellow fatty marrow. It's going to be hyper intense on T1. It's going to be mildly hyper intense or iso intense, meaning not really one or the other on T2 when you're in type 2, on T2 images when you're in type 2 modic changes. When we get towards type 3, believed to be representative of bone sclerosis, we're going to see hypo intense across both. So again, MRIs, T2 and T1 MRIs, they're great from a comparative nature because we see things like this happen a lot where something might be hyper and hypo intense in one stage and vice versa in another stage, and it's how you can tell where people are and determine where they're at on that spectrum of change based upon the comparative analysis between T2 and T1 images. So there we go. That was a lot about Modic changes over the last 15 minutes or so. I'm going to encourage you, if you haven't checked out our new website, you want to join thousands of other chiropractors discovering practical steps for practice success, head over to the blog at thesmartchiropractor.com. Hope you enjoyed clinical conversations. We're right on time. I was hoping to keep this right around 15 minutes. I think we're going to end right around there. So If you think this is a great featured series that you'd love to see more of in 2021 in this group, let me know by commenting down below. If you'd love to contribute to a future episode of Clinical Conversations, also let me know, because we would absolutely love to have you and showcase your expertise to over 1,500, I think at this point, other chiropractors out there taking care of people, doing a fantastic job, helping people live their best life. So I'm Dr. Jeff Langmaid. This has been all about Modic Changes, some more technical talk than I've given in a while. So if you have any feedback, leave it down below. I hope you have a fantastic weekend. I'll talk to you very soon. Bye-bye. Hey, if you like that video, be sure to subscribe to the Smart Chiropractor. We are posting videos on how you can market your chiropractic practice in a way that teach and invites consistently. We have found that is the magic formula to big time growth. So if you like this video, be sure to comment down below, smash that subscribe button, or visit us at thesmartchiropractor.com.